confirmation that we do have a quorum. So I'm going to go ahead and start today's meeting. And by opening it up, and I'm sure it'll be recorded. And then, so the next agenda item is confirmation of quorum from Ms. Anderson. And then the third item is climate action Q&A, where we left off from last week. We didn't get to all of the questions. I know there was quite a few questions in the chat box from committee members. And so staff would had a chance to look at that. And I'm sure some other questions came in also since last week. And then I do have myself some written questions to go from there. So I know Greg Clifton likes to do an introduction of everybody, even though we left off at the same agenda item. But I'll hand it over to Mr. Clifton if he's with us.
I am. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, sir. Oh, there you are with video.
Thank you, Chair Odegaard and Co-Chair Al White, and thank you to the entire committee. This is a reintroduction. Last week, I introduced Nicole Antonopoulos, our Sustainability Director. She's back in front of you tonight, and maybe Nicole, if you can do a repeat performance and introduce your wonderful staff, and we'll get rolling. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg, and Citizen Bond Committee members. Thank you for carving out time for us this afternoon. I am here with the climate team, Jenna Ortega, our climate engagement coordinator, Jenny Neiman, our climate manager, and Ramon Alatorre, our climate and energy analyst. So without any further ado, may we go ahead and pull up our presentation. And Jenny has agreed to be our presentation coordinator. Fantastic. It looks like it's up on the screen, but I do want to get confirmation that others can see it as well. I see some thumbs up. Fantastic. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, let's just dive into our presentation. Next slide, please. So the framework for our conversation today is to highlight the cost reductions and removals, the cost of reductions, removal, and delay for climate action, the bond package options that we hinted at last week, and then dive into the responses to the questions that were asked last week, and then open up the floor for further discussion. We plan to spend about 45 minutes of the meeting on our presentation and then leave the remaining time for questions and discussion. Next slide. Before I hand the presentation off to Ramon, I want to take a moment to revisit the Climate Emergency Declaration, which really grounds us in why we're here today. The citizen-initiated Climate Emergency Declaration. Oh, excuse me? Are we good? Okay. The Citizen-Initiated Climate Emergency Declaration sets a path to carbon neutrality by the year 2030 and is rooted in the concept of leadership, action, improvement, evolution, and investment. So as we go through the slides and our discussion this afternoon, I encourage you to hold on to that founding investment, if you will, in climate action. So with that, Ramon, please take it away.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Citizen Bond Committee. Next slide, please. So in just a few minutes, Nicole will have the microphone again, and she will be presenting some of the slides that offer a breakdown of the cost per ton of carbon that is reduced. However, before she gets there, I want to warn you that the numbers can be a bit eye-popping. I'm talking thousands of dollars per ton. However, we do want to take some time to emphasize that most of these values are referring to permanent reductions, which means that once they are achieved, their benefit is experienced year after year. And the framework of carbon neutrality makes this especially relevant. Recall that in order to be carbon neutral, we must have net zero emissions, which means that whatever we are unable to reduce must be balanced with removal. So if we produce 1,000 tons, we will have to put that on the left side of the scale, and then we will have to balance with 1,000 tons of removal on the right side. If we are more successful in achieving reductions and only produce 100 tons, then we will only have to balance with 100 tons. Next slide, please. So one might imagine two stylized scenarios where we assume that our initial emissions are 100 tons. In the first, we could achieve 90% reductions by 2030. In the second, we continue to delay, and by 2030, we haven't achieved any meaningful reductions. This would mean that in scenario A, we would still produce 10 tons of emissions in 2030. We would have to put those 10 tons on the left side of the scale and balance with 10 tons of removal. Similarly, for scenario B, we would have to put 100 tons on the left side of the scale and balance with 100 tons of removal. Next slide, please. Thank you. Let's say that those reductions come at a cost of $2,000 per ton. For scenario A, this would mean that in 2030, we will have spent $180,000 on reductions. For scenario B, we will have quote unquote saved money by not investing in reductions, and our spend before removal would be $0. Next slide, please. If we assume a price of $100 per ton for removal, and I will offer some justification for this price in a few slides, that means that the scenario A, we will have to pay $1,000 in 2030 to satisfy our removal obligation. And so our cumulative spend in 2030 would be an eye-popping $181,000. For scenario B, we will have to pay $10,000 in 2030 to satisfy our removal obligation, and this $10,000 will also represent our total spend. Next slide, please. Come 2031, the permanent reductions achieved in scenario A will remain without requiring any additional investment. This means that in 2031, our annual spend is only $1,000 for the removal of the 10 tons of unavoided emissions that year. And our cumulative spend only ticks up to $182,000. On the other hand, scenario B will require a second one-time payment of $10,000 to satisfy our removal obligation, bringing our cumulative total to $20,000. And now you can see where this is going. Scenario A is going to grow at $1,000 a year, while scenario B is going to grow at $10,000 per year. Next slide, please. By 2050, the cumulative spend for scenario A will have climbed to only $201,000, and for scenario B, it will have eclipsed the cost of scenario A for a cumulative spend of $210,000. This would be the year that simple payback would be achieved, if only considering the price of carbon removal without any escalation in price, which would be a limited and narrow assessment. Next slide. By 2060, the cumulative spend for scenario A will have only inched up to $211,000, while scenario B will be looking at well over $300,000 in total costs. This is nearly 50% more expensive than the scenario that makes early investments in permanent reductions. And this doesn't even begin to consider the other co-benefits associated with many of these projects. There are 1,000 analogies available here. Last week, we leaned into that of retirement, and this is what was meant when we said that early investments in reductions had a similar year-over-year compound impact to early investments for retirement. In the next few slides, I will make the case for forecasting a price of $100 per ton for carbon removal, a value which does show up again in the slides that follow. First, I will offer this table from the White House Technical Support document on the social cost of carbon. The carbon neutrality plan spends time discussing the social cost of carbon, and I won't be unpacking the concept fully here. However, the basic idea is that with increasing frequency and academic support, climate change is being pointed to as a prime example of a market failure. The issue being that the market in most economic analyses up till now has allowed the damage, suffering, and costs associated with a warming climate, both in the short and medium term, as well as from an intergenerational perspective, to escape as externalities. The social cost of carbon seeks to remedy this. It recognizes that a ton of carbon pollution released today will impact future generations, and it seeks to assign an economic valuation to that impact. Furthermore, as emissions accumulate over time, the social cost of carbon recognizes that every additional ton of pollution will have a greater impact than the one before. And again, the analogies are plentiful. One might consider a sunburn. Early on, the need to cover up is present, but perhaps not urgent. The worse the developing sunburn gets, the more important it becomes to seek protection, as the next ray may be the one that causes blisters to start forming. Next slide, please. It is for this reason that the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions has stated that the takeaway is simple. The social cost of carbon is going nowhere but up. Getting back to the White House technical support document, come 2030, the analysis suggests that the cost per ton of emissions will be at least $89. And I say at least because the document is littered with statements that emphasize that new evidence is suggesting that this $89 is very likely a significant underestimate. Furthermore, I would offer the observation that the Department of Energy's Carbon Negative Earthshot Initiative, which is a name meant to evoke the audacity of the 1960s moonshot, is to achieve durable and scalable carbon removal at a price of $100 per ton within a decade. Taken together, the fact that a quote-unquote Earthshot is to achieve meaningful removal at a price of $100 per ton, and the fact that a very likely underestimate of the social cost of carbon in 2030 is $100 per ton, we believe it is appropriate to utilize this $100 a ton as a conservative estimate of both the technical and social cost of carbon removal that will appear in the slides and tables that follow. And with that, I will pass the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramon. Committee members, I'd now like to take a deeper dive into the bond package options. Next slide. As you may recall, last week we introduced a robust $67.75 million proposal that consists of 3 packages. That proposal, known as option 1, is the best of what's possible to start our path, to jumpstart our path to carbon neutrality. The proposal is driven by data and the community's voice. Next slide. Acknowledging that option 1 is truly a menu of impactful elements due to our funding limitations, the extent of these offerings are noted in column 4. Committee members, you saw this slide last week, and before I provide more details on options 2 and 3, I want to share our strategy in developing the staff proposed options. Options 2 and 3 are rooted in the fact that there is a minimum threshold for a program to be viable. As you can see in the slide, rather than distributing funds across all options, we have targeted impacts and needs. I know you don't have to hear it from me, that you will have hard decisions to make. Our hope is that these additional options will offer you assistance in that decision-making process. Next slide. Allow me to take a moment to define some terms that you will be seeing on the coming slides. You saw these symbols last week, but as a refresher, the co-benefits symbols that we use are broken down by workforce development and jobs, support of the local economy, improvement of air quality, improvement of public health, providing cost savings to community, and leverageability, I think I maybe just made that word up, with federal funding. You also saw this term last week, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or MTCO2e. This is a globally accepted unit for measuring greenhouse gas emissions. The next term is the dollar per each ton of emissions we reduce. This will be reflected by the $/metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And finally, carbon payback. This is the return on investments, but only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. As I present each option, I will first introduce a package, so either healthy and affordable homes, energy independence and resilience, or community mobility, with options 1, 2, and 3. Then a summary table. I hope is that this will provide easy to understand comparisons of impacts. Next slide. So let's dive in. The first package is the Healthy and Affordable Homes package, and this has 3 package elements: efficient homes, healthy homes, and accessory dwelling unit infill accelerator. Next slide. Oh, great. Committee members, we prepared the following tables to speak to some of your questions about the cost per ton of carbon reduced. And while certainly a worthwhile note to take in your decision-making process, I'd be remiss if I didn't re-emphasize that a narrow carbon-only bang-for-the-buck assessment would fail to recognize the substantial co-benefits associated with many of these projects. Indeed, many of these co-benefits would contribute to the creation of jobs or generate savings for residents and/or the municipality, leaving more money in their pockets and contributing to a more holistic assessment of return on investment. So when you look at the carbon-only payback in the next to last column, please keep this in mind. This payback only considers how many years it would take before paying an equivalent amount of carbon removal that would add up to the cost of the project. After this point, every additional year that passes, the permanent and ongoing reductions realized by the project would result in savings compared to paying for removal annually. However, carbon alone is not the only lens that should be considered when viewing return on investment. As was mentioned in the slides about the social cost of carbon, society has largely struggled to capture long-term and intergenerational costs with economic models alone. Hence, the last column in the table indicates whether the project would likely be to generate savings and ROI outside of the carbon-only pricing framework. Thus, the carbon-only payback should really be considered as a starting point when considering a return on investment, or ROI. So for projects that have yes in the other ROI column, we could think about that yes as being a force that would turn the clock back, resulting in an even shorter payback period. The collective impact of options for healthy and affordable homes is highlighted in yellow and broken down by row. At 18 million, or just over $18 million, the metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent removed would be approximately 7,350 tons at a cost of $2,450 per metric ton reduced, with a carbon payback of 25 years. Now, option 2 for healthy and affordable homes. In the slide, we can compare option 1 and 2 in terms of budget. We see a span of reduction from 33 to 55%, a reduction in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents from 33 to 60%. Because we did not scale back all sub-elements equally, you may see payback both sooner or longer in the carbon payback column. The financial return ranges from 2 to 15 years with utility and fuel savings. Next slide. At $5 million, option 3 offers a 68% lower budget with a corresponding 60% lower reduction in metric ton carbon dioxide equivalents. Carbon payback is sooner because we kept the same numbers of loans, which had the bigger bang for the buck, and scaled back on deep retrofits, which actually take longer. The financial return is realized 5 years sooner, depending on conservation measures, and 3 to 15 years with monthly savings on utilities. Next slide. In sum, the healthy and affordable homes funding options are listed out by program offerings. I'll pause here for a moment so you can digest the options. And hopefully this format is working for the group because we have 2 more packages to review. Next slide. So next up is the Energy Independence and Resilience package. A little bit of housekeeping. In our presentation last week, we said that the highlighted number that you see at the bottom of the screen was 454 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. That was an artifact from before we combined the emergency and resilience hubs into a combination package. So I wanted to point out the corrected information to the committee. Moving on to combined impacts for the energy independence and resilience option, 1 is a package at $18 million. This has 6,800 metric ton carbon dioxide equivalent reduced, more than 13,000 metric tons offset, and a wide range of carbon payback from 6 to 49 years, yet significant return on investment beginning at year 6. Next slide. At $8.4 million, the combined impacts of option 2 include just under 4,000 metric tons of CO2e reduced, 16,000 metric tons offset, and a 23-year carbon payback, and similar financial returns. Next slide. At $7 million, option 3 incorporates a 62 to 75% budget reduction with corresponding reductions in carbon dioxide equivalents and similar outcomes in reductions, payback, and financial return. Next slide. In sum, the energy independence and resiliency funding options are listed out by program offerings. And again, I'll pause here for a few seconds so you can take a look. Next slide. The community mobility package has 2 elements: a safe and accessible bike and pedestrian infrastructure, as well as community electric transportation. Next slide. Similarly, we had a transcription remnant for bike and car share. The highlighted numbers on your screen are now accurate. I'll let you take a look at that. And that said, the $31.7 million community mobility package would result in nearly 4,500 metric tons of reductions. You'll note at this time we were unable to model carbon payback. However, we do know that the financial return would result in greater access to lower cost transportation and a decreased need for car ownership. Next slide. Option 2 would fund community mobility at $13.2 million with a 62% reduction in budget and carbon dioxide equivalent removal. But there is no change to the electric bike share or car share. Next slide. Option 3 at $8 million is a budget reduction of 73% with similar impacts to carbon dioxide equivalent removals and reductions. And then within this option, both e-bike and car share programs had to be removed. So in sum, the community mobility funding options are listed out by program offering. And again, I'll pause here for a moment so you can review this. With that, we would like to move on to responses to questions that were asked last week, and I'd like to hand the presentation back to Ramon.
Thank you, Nicole. I will be talking about some of the questions related to city facilities as well as electrification. I'll start with the city facilities. Just a moment to provide kind of city facilities 101 for members of the bond committee. The city has 140 buildings and approximately 970,000 square feet that we manage. Our total electricity costs in 2021 were just over $4 million. Our natural gas costs were over $326,000, and our total cost of energy was $4.4 million. Some questions that were asked is the new public works yards on Old 66 off-grid? And the answer to that is that the city's core services facility was built to what is known as the US GBC LEED standards. The facility received a rating of LEED Silver. And I did notice that in the chat there was a question about whether this presentation would be made available, and it will be, and we provided links here to be able to allow committee members to go learn more about these. Have any new city facilities been built since then? And the answer is that the city's newest facility is the courthouse, and that was built to Green Globes standards, which is sort of similar to LEED, but a little bit different. The facility received a rating of 3 Green Globes for this certification. And will the city commit to all new city facilities being built energy and water efficient? The city does have a sustainable building resolution. It was first adopted in 2008, and we are looking to bring it forward this spring or summer to have it updated. And this does speak towards sort of internal expectations and policy around new city facilities being built to high standards.
So,
Yeah.
The two bullet points that answer the first and second question, they don't speak to what that means in terms of an actual reduction of either carbon and or cost. When I said off the grid, I mean, can they heat themselves and power themselves? And I think that should be the goal that we look at in our new buildings. I understand that you have to have a connection in case things go wrong, but I would look forward to city facilities operating independent of any other.
Sure. Yeah, these are good points, and the silver LEED standard and the green globes LEED standard and the green globe standards, that they do not speak towards being off grid. Some of the ideas behind the resilience hubs that are part of this bond package are thinking about potentially putting some of the city facilities on what are known as microgrids or even resilience loops that could potentially allow for this. So some of what you're speaking to is some of what is being suggested within kind of the resilience and emergency hubs portion of the bond that we are recommending.
Is there resistance to that? Does anybody have a problem with that? I
don't know about. I think it's about the funding and whether or not we're able to make those investments at like strategic centers throughout. I think a lot of people think it's a good idea, but the question is, will the opportunity come forward to fund it?
Well, okay. So, I mean, any thoughts to bonding there?
I may, and apologies, I'm having a hard. Exactly it. We are trying to create some standalone energy independent facilities and hubs with a focus on emergency response facilities first and foremost.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Great. Another question had to do with dollar return as it relates to upgrading city facilities, as well as the carbon dioxide tonnage reductions. And to answer this question, I do want to emphasize that the city is actually currently in the process of having all of our facilities audited in what's known as an investment grade audit through an energy conservation contract that we have entered into in the last 6 months. Upon request, our energy services provider generated this analysis so that we could give the committee a sense of return on investment that can be expected for different energy conservation measures. As you'll see, the current audit is only at 30% completion, and it includes HVAC analysis of our systems, lighting, weatherization, water services is also a top priority. And the city facilities have numerous critical needs that will not be able to be addressed through a savings-only ESCO model. And so providing additional funding for this initiative would be leveraged against the payment through savings financing model to increase the magnitude of conservation measures that could be explored as a part of the energy conservation contract. Next slide, please. So this is just another slide of typical energy conservation measures and associated ROI. And while, as I mentioned, the investment grade audit is still underway, early indications suggest that with financing available to roll up additional projects into the ESCO framework, we might expect a 5 to 10% reduction in energy use. This is not including water and wastewater. And with a 10% or greater reduction in emissions, depending on the amount of fuel switching and renewable energy that can be accomplished. And as you may recall from our Facilities 101 slide, if we were to achieve a 10% reduction in our total municipal energy consumption today, that would result in savings of nearly $450,000. And so this is just a summary of what I mentioned on some rather crowded slides, that we are actively engaged in an energy savings contract. Energy conservation measures will provide return on investment at city facilities. Funding will allow us to roll up projects that might not otherwise be available in the savings only ESCO model. And a 10% reduction in municipal energy consumption would result in significant savings. Next slide, please. All right, I will now talk about some of the questions associated with building electrification. I do just want to start with some of the basics, recognizing that building electrification is critical to the success of the carbon neutrality plan. We know that about 45% of Flagstaff's buildings emissions do come from the on-site combustion of natural gas, and that over 50% of home-based emissions come from natural gas combustion. So fuel switching is necessary to achieve the reductions piece. It's both the reductions and the cleaner piece of the prescriptive model. We must transition appliances, processes, and generations that combust fossil fuels on site to ones that use clean electricity. Electric space heating and water heating have come a long way in the last decade. There are cold weather heat pumps that are now able to heat homes during weather as low as -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide, please. So some of the specific questions. There was a question about what is the environmental impact on electrification prior to all electricity being solar? When is the solar creation of electricity due to be complete? This is a really great question. It gets at the nuts and bolts of electrification, because electrification really does only work from an emissions perspective if the electricity is sufficiently clean. Indeed, electrification in the Pacific Northwest, for example, where nearly 90% of electricity comes from clean hydro, has been a no-brainer for decades. Here in Arizona, however, that hasn't necessarily been the case until somewhat recently. And I'll start with a few notes about where the local grid is going. Many here may know that APS has committed to providing electricity that is 100% clean by 2050. This is the goal that gets a lot of the headlines, but what is perhaps a little less known are some of the intermediate goals. By 2030, APS is targeting electricity that is 65% clean, with 45% coming from renewables. By 2031, coal will be completely eliminated. Back in 2019, the electricity provided was already 50% clean, and today in 2022, it is marching towards that 65% intermediate goal. That said, I too have been curious about this question. I do, conceptually understand that switching today, I will have an appliance in operation for the next 15 to 25 years that is getting cleaner and cleaner over time just because the grid is getting cleaner. But there is still sort of that curiosity. If I switch today, am I taking 2 steps backwards in order to take 18 steps forwards? Or in other words, is it possible that for a year or two, the electric appliance would be more emissions intensive than a gas appliance? And so last year, I did reach out to the researchers at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who've done a tremendous amount of research on this, and they provided me with the following response. Next slide, please. So here you'll see that there's a decreasing blue line, which shows the emissions intensity of Arizona's grid. The dashed red line shows the break-even point for how clean the grid needs to be for a heat pump to be an emissions benefit compared to a gas furnace. We've actually been under this threshold for a while. And you can see that because we are under and the grid is continuing to get cleaner, a heat pump installed in 2020 was forecast to result in 56% reduction in emissions over a 15-year period. Now, before handing the presentation over to Jenny, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we know that electrification is a pretty new topic in our community. There are a lot of people with very similar, very good questions, and we are working on providing education and partnering with industry experts to help address these questions and have the nuanced conversations. And indeed, on March 31st, we will be hosting a 1-hour community education event where instructors from the Electric League of Arizona will present on cold weather heat pump technology and considerations, as well as offer a 30-minute Q&A session. So please consider joining for that event and telling your friends. And now with that plug out of the way, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jenny Neiman.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much, Chair Odegaard, and to the committee for having us again today. So I'm going to answer some questions around housing and transportation because there were a lot of questions and they've somewhat overlapped. I'm going to start with a broad review for how we think about these very, very large and complex topics because I think they help to answer the questions and questions that we regularly get. Of housing. So we think about a couple things. The first is climate migration. I will warn you, I don't like to talk about the negative side of climate change a lot. The positive side of climate action is much more powerful. However, this is where this kind of comes up. So we'll see that almost 1 in 2 Americans will start to see a significant decline in their physical environment. And it also, in the next 45 years, 1 in 12 Americans are expected to move regions. So this is from the southeast of the US to the Midwest, for instance, just due to climate change, not due to jobs or quality of life, etc. We also know that heat is one of the strongest drivers of migration. That trend is expected to continue through the next couple decades and through climate change. In Arizona, the picture's pretty bleak for central and southern Arizona. Much of Arizona is expected to experience consistent temperatures over 95 degrees. And that means, having days that don't get below 95 degrees at all for half of the year. They're already starting to see this. They're going to see more and more days over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where that will bring significant economic damage and significant migration. Flagstaff has already started to see in migration. It's from Arizona, but I want to be clear, Flagstaff is seen as a sort of climate safe place, despite our high fire risks and other risks that we see for across the country. And so we won't just have migration from southern and central Arizona. We will likely see migration from across the country due to our higher elevation. In terms of energy burdens, a high energy burden is defined as paying more than 6% of one's income on energy. So this is your monthly energy bill. There's sometimes several of them. This is a national figure. We know that for low-income families, 2/3 of them are paying more than 6%. And of that group, over half pay over 10% of their income for energy. These numbers are really high in Flagstaff. They're also very, very high in Coconino County. This is a huge concern, right? When we think about affordable housing, we want to think about affordable living, right? If you're paying larger than 10% of your income on energy, it decreases your ability to pay for other things, maybe health, maybe education, maybe housing. And so we know that retrofits are a really, really important tool here. And if they are focused on low-income families, that they can reduce energy burdens by 25%. In terms of affordable living, so we think about housing, transportation, and utility cost. Car ownership and dependence is a costly burden for everyone. We know it's mostly a burden for low-income families. And so our transportation package aims to reduce those transportation costs for all residents of Flagstaff. Our programs are targeted at low-income community members. E-Bike Share will provide free or no-cost memberships to residents from low-income households. This is standard practice for across the country for bike share systems. EV car share, we would like to base at housing sites. So again, if you can access a car share program, it means maybe you don't need to own a car to be able to get to work, to be able to meet your needs. Finally, a return on investment. This is really just residential energy efficiency beats the stock market. You can get an 18% return annually on energy efficient investments. And so every day and month that we do not make these investments, we're leaving money on the table. And it means that families in Flagstaff are paying more than they should be. This is really a problem of financing, right? It's a problem of making upfront investments. We know who can make upfront investments in our community. Those are higher income families, right? And what we want to do is help more folks be able to make those investments so that they can realize those cost savings. In terms of housing and climate, this is just sort of how we think about it from the carbon neutrality plan perspective. We look at, and this is sort of what we need to do through the carbon neutrality plan to not only achieve our climate goals, but also to make a stronger community. We need to reduce home energy usage, reduce energy costs. That is really reducing that energy burden. We need to increase density. This is both for housing, right, as well as for transportation, helping people live closer to meet their needs, live closer to their work. Finally, we need to make sure that our community members can live in Flagstaff, right? People already struggle to get there. We need to reduce parking requirements. Parking requirements add a significant amount to the cost of housing and can be really burdensome. There are cities across the country completely getting rid of parking requirements. Finally, these all lead to reducing car dependency. So in terms of the question, it would be helpful to see how they fit in with the housing emergency. We work really closely with our housing team. Housing and sustainability are intricately related. I sort of spoke to this before. Cost of living is really determined by many different factors. Housing is the largest. Climate action can also help to address these costs, right, and to better support our low-income residents. In terms of do any of the CMP initiatives conflict with our community goal? No. So all of our residential focus items in the bond that Nicole went through will reduce costs for participating residents. Energy retrofits and rebates provide services or a cash rebate, and then the resident gets those monthly energy savings. Rebates, same thing, they get a cash rebate, as well as ongoing cost savings, because new efficient stoves require 30% less wood. And then finally, ADU accelerator, ADU increase housing supply in existing neighborhoods. So that's one-time cash, ongoing rental income, and monthly energy savings, because those will be efficient. Next is transportation. So all of our transportation focus items are also aiming to reduce costs for Flagstaff residents. These programs are targeted at low-income community members, as I already talked about. In terms of ADU accelerator, it was asked, will these incentives include a restriction against short-term rentals and therefore provide potential housing? The proposed accelerator would preclude use for short-term rentals. That's because it's an incentive program, so we're able to have more restrictions. Can ADUs be successful given HOA restrictions? I found those to be one of the biggest barriers to ADUs. Absolutely. We have 148 HOAs in Flagstaff. We know that some covenant conditions and restrictions can restrict ADUs. So yeah, this is absolutely a factor. There are a lot of neighborhoods that do not have ADUs though, right? And so we'd really look first to try and increase ADUs in those neighborhoods. A lot of our older neighborhoods don't have HOAs, etc. Finally, on transportation, again, I'm going to go through 2 quick slides on just thinking about these from a concept level. So in terms of how we get around, our car trips are very short. So almost 40% of car trips in Flagstaff are less than 2.5 miles. 2.5 miles can be, about a 20-minute bike ride if you're going at a pretty leisurely pace. 11% of our car trips are less than a mile. So when we talk about transportation, we're not expecting to that everybody's going to bike. First of all, we have a lot of different people with a lot of different abilities to bike, whether that's their physical abilities, whether that's personal circumstance. But we know that we have a lot of trips that are really short. And so how can we think about those short trips and switching some of them over to walking and biking? 17% of our work trips today are made by walking, biking, and transit. That's about a quarter of all trips made by those modes. We do know that more people will walk and bike when it's comfortable, convenient, and useful. There's really good evidence that says when these modes are prioritized, people do walk and bike more. It's sort of an if you build it, they do come. Walking and biking are critical elements of our transportation system. It really is about providing options for all users. Walking and biking can help us manage congestion, give people more options. They are also critical to transit. We also have high facility needs. So something like almost half of our streets in Flagstaff don't have sidewalks on both sides. So there's a lot to think about when we think about our transportation systems. From an equity standpoint, this is the lens through which we approach a lot of our transportation work. Approximately 1/3 of Flagstaff residents do not drive. This includes children. It also includes older adults. It includes folks who may not have a license for whatever reason. And we really need to think about that. That's a huge percentage of our population. A lot of folks can't afford to drive. A lot of folks may not have reliable access to the car. What we don't want to do is say you have to have a car to live in Flagstaff, right? What we want to do is try to say you can live in Flagstaff without a car and you can get rid of a huge expense in your life. Finally, we have a large differences in Modeshare across Flagstaff. This shows us that we have inequitable facilities. There's a lot of walking and biking and transit use around NAU, around Flagstaff's downtown and core. It's less so in other places. And so how can we help other folks to take these sorts of trips? We also know that safety is not equitably distributed. So you are more likely to be a victim of traffic violence, so to be injured or hit or killed while you are trying to move around where you live, if you are older, if you're a person of color, if you're walking, or if you live in a low-income neighborhood. Finally, the benefits, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the benefits of investing in active transportation are wide. They have a huge return on investment, not just from a financial standpoint, but health, economics, etc. So the question, can I explain how the 30 million in bike ped improvements is different than what was invested? It's a wonderful question, thank you. So the 2018 bond package, we refer to that as Proposition 419, that was a transportation package. It gave $29 million to walking and biking. Since then, we've gotten about a $5 million grant. That gives us about $34.5 million. In this middle column right here, I have what is funded by 419. So that's about 15% of the sidewalks we need funded. It's about 10% of the foots that we need to build. It's a little more than half of the enhanced crossings. So these are crossings like the new one you might see on Route 66 or down on 4th Street. And finally, it's less than 10% of the bridges and tunnels that we need. In terms of what these potential improvements, absolutely, we have a lot of maps. I'm just going to show two as an example. Red and orange are funded through Prop 19 and that grant. Blue is unfunded. So again, those are the numbers. We have funded about 15% of them. Unfunded, we will work to fill in this gap. Next is foots. Red, green, as well as some green are funded via Prop 19. The blue is unfunded. So again, it's a huge portion of our network that we still need to fund. Finally, transportation is there a connection between investment in the foots essentially and higher utilization for getting to and from services? The answer is absolutely. There's abundant evidence from throughout the US that when you build it, people will come. Right now, about half of our foot trips are commutes. And so we know that foots are a primary way that people use in order to get to work. We also know that foots are built primarily for commuting. And so when we plan foots, all the new foots that we need to build, those are really built around commuting, around getting to services, what we call functional transportation. We know that also distance isn't the main limiting factor. We know that there is a lot of evidence that says, people want safer places to bike and to walk and to get them to transit. And so it's not really distance that's the issue that sees, it's safety, it's having a complete network that really fills in those gaps. All right, Nicole, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Wonderful, thank you. I am having a very difficult time posting in the chat. So hopefully I was being able to catch up or keep up with my phone. But now we are going to move into just some of the overall proposal questions that came up last week. Next slide. Great. There was a request to see the state restrictions slide again. So I went ahead and just put up this quick recap of some of the existing legislation that has passed over the last decade. This does not include any current bills, but these are, as we talked about last week, something since 2010 through 2020 that influence our work on climate action at the local government level. Next slide. And just also following up on that request, reiterating that we have no legal mechanism to, in the state of Arizona currently, to establish a climate action tax similar to BB&B or a fee that's associated perhaps with building permit application fee. All right, the next question, and bear with me, I'm operating kind of on the fly here from my phone, is about pricing. And so the main point of this question is that why were some programs not deemed essential to the proposal under option 3? And I did try to address this earlier and in the presentation, but some programs do have minimum funding thresholds to actually work, meaning it is difficult to just turn the dials down equally across all of them. So just providing an example, it would be very difficult to develop a bike share program with less than $1 million. So that is an example of an all or nothing. Same with car share, it doesn't make economic or impact sense to develop a program with less than 6 vehicles. And so as a result, the bike ped infrastructure took cuts. And we can dive into that because I believe there was another question that got posted in the chat. Next slide. And then there was a question last week about overlap with stormwater needs. And absolutely correct, there are overlaps. The infrastructure needs in stormwater are truly about resiliency and about equity. And these are goals of the carbon neutrality plan. So there is direct overlap and complement. Next slide. Regarding federal funding, we did try to answer this a little bit last week, but at this time, we really can't give a concrete answer. As I mentioned, federal funding is being distributed through several different agencies. I did check in with our grants manager, Stacy Breckler-Knaggs, this afternoon, and what she stated, quote, was, "We are seeing for the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, an 80% federal share, 20% local share. In some cases, we are seeing a 90-10 split. We are also seeing, in regards to federal earmark appropriations, those are 100% funded. So that just gives you a flavor of the wide array of how funds are being distributed. We are obviously keeping a very keen eye on federal funding as it continues to develop. Next slide. Great. There was a question about how these recommendations came forward, asking if it was staff or the commission. As we tried to adjust this a little bit in the chat last week, but as we've been expressing to the committee this week and last week, that the carbon neutrality plan truly calls for very prescriptive actions. And those are correlated to impact analyses. And so I offered an example in this slide that we know that we must reduce energy use in the residential sector by 43%, which is a 51% reductions in emissions by the year 2030. So with that in mind, the strategies for mitigation in each of the sectors that we focus on, the built environment, transportation, and waste, were taken to the Flagstaff community for input. So the Sustainability Commission did approve the carbon neutrality plan and the general framework for the bond sub-elements. And then let's go to the last slide. And committee members, this is really just to highlight that we're all in this together. Everything that you've been hearing up to this point in terms of need is to build a stronger Flagstaff. And we recognize, as I mentioned earlier, the hard choices that you are going to have to make. But please know that everything you're discussing will help build a stronger community. So with that, shall we open it up for discussion? And I'm going to see if I can fix my Teams really quick while that is happening.
And with that, I see Vice Chair Al White has his hand up, and then I see some comments in the chat box, and maybe people that have questions that are in the chat box could raise their hand, and then we'll answer them as we go.
Thank you. Nicole, you put 2 slides up there answering my question about what sustainability is working on. It says what we're working on in 2021 and 2022. That's the only part of that slide that's readable. You said,
oh, really? Yeah, I'm having problems. Okay, let's see if we can get that back up. But we did highlight some information.
Let me finish. Well, it's part of the question. Those slides, are those from the presentation that you did to this group last week, or did you do that presentation to someone else to show them what sustainability was working on?
Oh, that was the presentation to this group from last week.
All right, so I have that somewhere. Okay.
And real quick, if you click on those slides, you can see them. If you click on them from in the chat.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Thank you.
So these things that you're doing now are regardless of whether bond passes or doesn't pass.
Correct.
This is what sustainability is working on.
Yeah, this is what the climate team is working on. The rest of the sustainability team is working on much more as well. But this is just a snapshot.
Okay. And how is that funded? Just general fund?
It is, so the sustainability section is funded through the environmental management fee, which is a fee that is assessed on monthly municipal services bill that's directly correlated to water consumption as well as solid waste consumption. And then there is also general funds that come into, are transferred into the sustainability section budget to help offset programmatic needs.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Vice Chair, did you get all your questions answered that you
No.
might have?
Yeah, so far so good. Thank you very much, and I'll mute myself again.
I think maybe I know there was several questions by committee member Ms. McLaughlin. If you would like to chime in.
Yeah, I just asked about the energy rebates, retrofits, if those were targeted to owner occupancy or income levels. And it looks like Jenny got back to me in the chat about prioritizing those and tiering programs. So I don't know if you want to answer that to everybody, Jenny, or what, but yeah.
Sure, I appreciate it, Devonna. Yeah, so our goal, right, the financing, right, we know lower income families can finance retrofits, right? And so the main goal for retrofits is really lower income families. For rebates, we're going to do a tiered program where you get, right, more back based on low incomes. We already do that at least a little bit. We just started this year giving kind of a higher rebate or a prebate for low income families. With this amount of funding, it would be very different, right? It would be a much more sophisticated program to do that. But that is really our focus, right? We know who has the problems getting these things financed and done and making that upfront investment. I wanted to answer to your question, Devon. I was writing it. You had asked about, in terms of on the maps, what exactly the 30 million would go to in terms instead of just unfunded. I do not have that answer. We have a lot of priority sort of systems in place to say which is the next one, right? And so our transportation team has that. We haven't run it through the $30 million filter. Basically, they just have their priority list, and the 30 million will get to those next priorities. In some ways, the Prop 419 is kind of filling in, getting us to sort of like a base level of things, and then you know, this 30 million will get us that next step towards where we need to be really supporting walking and biking. Thanks for that great question.
So then as a follow-up, if I could, is the Prop 419 work done? You're muted, Jenny, sorry.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
It is a 20-year bond. And so some of those projects are just beginning. And so you will see these, again, 28 enhanced crossings will probably be very, very noticeable when you'll start to see those, et cetera. So yeah, that will be coming along in the next really 18 years.
So then if that work's going to be done over the next 18 years, explain to me how an additional $30 million would be phased in. Would it be all like added to the workload next year whenever it starts, or would you finish the first 18 years and then do the next, you know, $30 million worth of work? You haven't spent the first, you know, 34 million. So I'm curious about the next 30 million.
Sure. So that bond was passed in 2018, right? And so it really, I believe the money just started being available in 2020. And so a lot of it is planning, right? And doing the design work and everything. So we are beginning to see things coming through. It will be added on, right? A lot more capacity to do that. If it helps for perspective, when 419 was being passed, the figure that was used to help identify those needs, this was a 20-year bond. It really identified projects that we had, or that the transportation team had seen were needed for like a 1 to 5 year timeline. That was the amount of funding that was given, right? They were sort of seen as the short-term projects, not the medium-term projects of what we need to see in the next 20 years. So this $30 million will really help us to give adequate funding for what we believe is needed over the next 30 years.
But would it be spent after the remaining 18 years worth of money is
Concurrently.
spent?
Concurrently.
Currently, okay. All right, and then is there a budget annually for sidewalks and Futz Trail improvement or addition that the city already allocates on an annual basis?
That is a great question. There are projects through the capital improvement plan, but they are not large projects, right? There are some that happen if we happen to be redoing a road, may happen as part of other projects. But in terms of substantial projects, it's really through these propositions that we're funding transportation.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may, is my microphone still on? I have absolutely no control.
You're good.
Okay, great, excellent. Committee Member McLaughlin, thank you so much for those questions because they're really, really important. And I just want to throw out a reminder that the city has millions in unmet needs, and I believe we highlighted this last week in terms of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure with a price tag of over $100 million. So Prop 419 is definitely a step in the right direction, but the goal here is to really accelerate all of the projects that are, not all, but some key priority projects that were identified by the community and by bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, bicycle and pedestrian committees as high priorities.
Okay, thank you. Committee member Ms. House, did you have a question? I saw either was a comment or a question maybe in the chat box.
I think they've somewhat addressed it. It's basically just that question of when we're getting down into the options and starting to see so many programs kind of phased away. I'm just wondering about the viability then of those as like, is that, I have a hard time looking at option 3 as a really viable option when it's cutting out almost half of what's being proposed overall. But I understand the threshold that you were sharing, so I appreciate that. I'm struggling with that a little bit.
Yes, thank you. And by no means was this was a very difficult exercise, and at times it was just very painful because the needs are across the board, if you will. And our goal, again, in terms of taking the data, the community feedback, as well as impacts, and trying to create a holistic package that really does justice to the various packages and then the needs in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is just a recommendation from staff. The committee obviously has the luxury to dive very deep into this. And that is exactly why we wanted to provide that full menu in option 1, so the committee could see the extent of what's possible as we launch into, hopefully launch into some very lofty climate action projects.
Great, thank you. Sorry, that was my cat acknowledging you speaking.
Thanks. I can't see
All
any. I can kind of put some stuff up, but.
Yeah, so Vice Chair, I see Al White, I see your hand up. Do you have some other questions you'd like to ask?
No, I meant to take it down. I guess I thought I had lowered it. So, no, go to others.
Okay, I see Ms. McLaughlin had a question again in the chat box.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at the map and I just wonder, as we develop more areas, would any of those unfunded bike trails be part of like future development plans where we would negotiate with developers to extend a FUTS or do a bridge or whatever it is?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so we, as part of development agreements all the time, right? There's some things that happen. Those end up normally when they come to the foots trails, they end up being linkages, right? As opposed to a whole new trail. In terms of bridges and tunnels, right? Those are probably too big, but is there a, pedestrian crossing, right? That we can put in, right? There's a lot of crossings on those lists. That's not the map that I was there, but if you look at the map of needs, right? That might be more appropriate for the development. So yes, some things can happen that way. It's all part of the balance of development. As I know you know well, Devana, right? And so, what do we give up? What are we getting, et cetera? It's all part of that. We can't necessarily depend on it. Do we try very hard to get those things when we have developments? Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then committee member Mr. Ghetto, hand raise.
Thank you, Chair Odegaard. So listen, everybody, I don't have any real opinions yet. There's a lot of work. But let me just step back, and I apologize if I wasn't listening great. We had 3,500 citizens really feel strongly about carbon neutrality. We had a plan put together by a commission. We have unanimous support for carbon neutrality from our council members. And that is a 2030 deadline, which is 8 years away. If we went with option one, which I can't get over, is only $1,000 per person. That's the way I look at it. We have 75,000 citizens as a denominator. It's less than 1,000. If we were to spend all of that money, are we going to get to carbon neutrality in 2030? Or if not, how close will we get? Have we already admitted defeat if we don't choose option one?
DC, do you want to try and take this one? It's a great question, Ron Ghetto. I can say we will not admit defeat. And this is DC has more on the numbers. We will be much, much closer to carbon neutrality than we would be if we did not invest. But DC has real numbers, not just pep talk.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of nuance in the goal of getting to carbon neutrality. The carbon neutrality plan in some ways makes some acknowledgments that we're not going to be able to reduce our way to carbon neutrality by 2030. The goal sets out an ambitious goal of reducing 44% of our emissions by 2030 and acknowledging we're going to have to make up that gap with a significant amount of carbon removal, which means the work is still ahead of us for years to come after 2030 to continue to drive down those emissions. We know that continued reductions will continue to have those sort of compounding impacts, right? So no, this was not like our one shot to fund the entire carbon neutrality plan in a bond package. We know that we are going to be continuing to go for federal funding to find all sorts of other efforts to be able to move towards that 44% reductions and figure out how it is that we're going to develop some of the portfolio of carbon removal projects as well. So this is a piece of the entire thing. I think if you added up all of the reductions within, I actually didn't take the time to do this for it, but it definitely comes up short of the 44% reductions we're looking for, but it helps get us in motion on that way, and is kind of like the seed money to even like stand up some programs so that as those programs are in motion, we can continue to fund those and be able to demonstrate that we've got programs that are reducing the building emissions from people's homes. And if we had more capacity, then we could go faster and do it. So, I think we think of this as in many ways as being kind of seed funding to get some programs the necessary momentum, but it's not going to be the one thing that achieves carbon neutrality in this community.
And thank you so much, Ramon, for that. And if I may add to that is the other actors in our community that will also help us achieve carbon neutrality. And so that's going to be Northern Arizona University that is working on its climate action plan right now. It's going to be FUSD that has just assembled a climate action team. It's going to be Coconino County that has just directed staff to look into developing a climate action plan. It's going to be our businesses that have already made, you know, kind of the larger actors, if you will, that have already made commitments to climate action. And then at the local level, businesses that will be making commitments. So this standalone will not do it, but the city organization is not the only responsible actor in this. And so we also will be taking into account, I'm just going to offer this as an example, that when NAU finalizes its climate action plan, we're going to go back to crunching those data points into our system and adjust accordingly. Our hope is that it will help accelerate the gap that we are and lessen that gap. So, you know, this bond initiative by no means in and of itself will take care of our carbon neutrality goals or help us achieve full carbon neutrality, but this is a very critical element of jumpstarting our work and providing those resources to the community. And Jenny, did you want to add one thing?
I just added in the chat. I think it's really helpful to think about too in terms of levers of control. These are some of the hardest items, right? Helping our low-income families make investments into their homes is really difficult, and nobody else is going to do that, right? Besides probably the city of Flagstaff, maybe the feds, right? We're going to try for that too, right? Building bike lanes, right? Building sidewalks on our streets, building, you know, safe ways for pedestrians to get around. That's only going to be the city of Flagstaff. A lot of the things, as Nicole just said, are going to be driven by our partners, et cetera.
And also building on that, if I may, we're also really hoping, and some of the other work that we're doing that we haven't had a chance to showcase to the committee, I feel like we could have spoken to you for an hour every week for the last 6 weeks to really highlight the work that we're doing. But one thing, for example, is the work we're focusing on to help advance carbon dioxide removal as a business development opportunity in our region, and the collaboratives that we are working on with Boulder County, Colorado, and a variety of other communities that we've inspired to join us to try to drive some market shifts in carbon dioxide removal. And there's no reason that we can't couple business development with climate action.
Okay, thank you. And I'll go with the hand raising. The first one we had was committee member Ms. Morano, and forgive me if I said your last name incorrect.
That's okay. Yeah, I think, Ron, I just want to respond really quickly, and I hope that I'm not responding out of turn here because the responses from Ramon and Nicole and Jenny were so spot on, but you're hitting on a really important point about how much is within our control and how much is beyond. And these bond asks are so important for things that we can control here in Flagstaff. And there's so many forces that are beyond our control at the national, at the world level, to really be driving those emissions down. And anything that we can do here locally is so important, but it really highlights the importance of getting engaged and making our whole country and our whole federal solutions more available to us. Like everything that we can do to further that mission and to take action here locally, but to enable the action locally through our federal avenues as well. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and it just really highlights the enormousness, is that the right word, of what we're trying to tackle and trying to take control for what we can.
Okay, thank you. And then the next hand raise I had was from committee member Mr. Moore.
Thanks. And just to piggyback on what everybody is saying, I guess it's when we were looking at this, it's obviously very, very important, but it's a really complex global issue, and we're looking at very hyper-local solutions. Do you guys, can you offer any context as far as like sister communities that you're working in partnership that have done some of these things? That, you know, are we one of the dominoes that if this domino falls, then it'll open up a larger solutions oriented for the region, or where are we at with that?
I love this question, and I'll start off and then ask any of the other climate team members to jump in. We are definitely leaders in the state of Arizona and seen as leaders in the Four Corners region. And that is an honor and also an incredible responsibility. We work closely with our peers around the country through our professional network. That's called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. We are also tied in at an international level, keeping apprised of C40, which is 40 large cities around the world that have committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions significantly. We have our peer, for example, who we chatted about last week in Ann Arbor as a community that has a lot of similar demographics in terms of being a university town, in terms of their affordable housing challenges, and in terms of their carbon neutrality goals to reach neutrality by 2030. So we have a lot of community around this, but in the Southwest, we definitely are considered in that tier of leadership, and especially in the state. With that in mind, I did mention, our most recent collaborative with Boulder County, Colorado, and that is because they know the work we're doing and we know the work that they are doing, and it aligns. So we look to those peer communities to learn from, but also to collaborate with, so we can help move that needle further and faster, and utilize the limited resources that there are in the most efficient way.
And I'll just add on really quickly, there have been other cities that have done climate bonds as well. Denver is a close and high profile example. There are many others as well. In terms of investment in these things, we may even be behind, right? Other cities have been doing a lot more investment in terms of these national peers that we look to, in terms of whether it's home retrofits or active transportation, et cetera.
Yes, we have the policy. We just need the investment behind it now to bring it all together.
Yeah, I was just going to similarly mention that there are quite a few communities that we've looked to when thinking about how we would develop some of these programs, from the like the deep retrofits program, which actually we had one ourselves back during the ARA era. But looking at how others have done it, also to rebates and the assisted loan program and things like that. Lots of communities have tried some of these, and there are lessons to be learned and opportunities to kind of build and stand on the shoulders of others.
Absolutely. And frankly, to Ramon's point, there are communities, let's say Burlington, Vermont, that from an energy standpoint is something that we aspire to from their energy programming. And equally, as a funding mechanism, we know that a number of other states, as Jenny mentioned, have or jurisdictions have pursued bonds. And so, yeah, we have a lot of aspiring communities. At the same time, we are also in that forefront of leadership in terms of setting goals and policies.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat box or hand raise. I did have a couple questions my own. I did have 3 originally, but one was answered already. The question I have is concerning the sustainability department itself. I want to thank Mr. Clifton for raising the sustainability, on its own category instead of kind of buried in the basement like it was in the past. With, say, option 1, if the voters did approve it, and if that's were the case in a what if scenario, would sustainability, as far as a department, would it have to grow to carry out the wishes of the community if something were to pass? And it could be as option 1, for example. Does does the department have the ability to carry forward the wishes if the community did pass such a thing with option one without having to put onto the council of saying, okay, we would have to increase the budget item, or is there dollars available within option one to, I guess, would have to grow the department to carry out the wishes of the community? Does that make sense what I just asked?
It absolutely does. And you are 100% correct. And thank you for asking that question, because that's the reality of these bond initiatives. And we've been having a fair amount of conversation in similar light about bonds. The reality is we are beyond our capacity as it is right now. The carbon neutrality plan sealed that deal. And if any of these options or an option 4 is proposed and brought forward to the city council for consideration, there would absolutely need to be a discussion about what that would mean in terms of the resources that we would have to be bringing on. The good news is, though, and I hopefully was able to drop in the chat, it's showing a white box for me, but slide number 17 from our presentation that highlights all three options against one another. I would like to say that a number, and this was intentional as well, we have a number of these programs are already, if you will, shovel ready. So there would be an expansion on some of the programming. And so we would have a very good idea of what was needed for additional resources in terms of personnel. But I cannot answer with a high level of confidence. For example, if let's just say option 2 were recommended and $11.5 million was directed to additional bike and pedestrian infrastructure, what that would mean for our capital team and engineering and so forth. But that is something we would be happy to dive into once, if the committee would like us to look at that.
I'm not sure, how far I want you to go with something like that, but, we just have to be aware that, whatever does happen by the residents, that it does put another resource strain on the organization as far as like the general fund budget dollars. And maybe, I'm not sure if Mr. Clifton would be able to respond. Just mention, like Prop 419. There was an extra money that were sent out, and of course it's over 20 years, and so not much was added. Maybe as staff members, maybe there could have been another 1 or 2 staff members added to the organization from what the voters decided on. And that's in the case, I guess, with any of the bond questions that may be asked of the residents. And I'm sure there is budget implications to that. Mr. Clifton, are you still on? Just speak to that for just a moment. Since we're limited in time.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. It is a discussion that we're having. In fact, we're having that topic is actively on the table right now, as our budget team has been meeting all of last week and all of this week and into next week, every day, almost all day, to chat about the division needs and so forth today. And it will continue. The topic of the 5-year plan has been raised. I know Rick Tatter's with us and he can jump in on this one as well. We are definitely talking about future needs with respect to staffing, operational costs, maintenance costs, so forth. Is just talking about the projects and the programs at the front end and the capital costs associated with the implementation of those projects and programs is not the complete discussion. We need to further that with a discussion about staffing needs and so forth. It's an active discussion, and I can't give you any specifics other than I think your question is, are those are those things an item for us to consider? And my response, Chair, is absolutely they are. Absent the internal staffing, we of course utilize a lot of outside consultation. We do that with our projects. I could rattle off a number of them right now, like the Lone Tree Overpass and others, where we have to bring in assistance from the outside. We do not have the capacity to deal with all of these things internally. But those, even the consultation services, of course, bring added costs. Sometimes they're factored into the cost of the project, similar to inflation and some of the other things we've talked about. But I think as time marches on, we seem to be a little bit more reactive with our staff needs. And I don't think it necessarily is in lockstep with the programs and projects that are being planned, but that they are active discussions nevertheless. Thank you for the question. It's a very good question.
No, you're welcome, and thank you. Just one last question I had. It's going to be a big lift, whatever happens. And, one of the items, Ramon, that you mentioned, was carbon removal. To me, that seems, how do you do that, since it would be a big part of the plan? Do you just I know we're short on time. Do you have any comments about how would we do that in a minute or so less time wise?
Yeah, the trouble is I gave a 45-minute presentation about this last May to council. It can be hard to have a short answer to the question. Nicole has referred to the project that we're, I suppose, most excited about at the moment, which is the sort of coalition with Boulder County right now, recognizing that they're, we're not the only community thinking about carbon removal and looking at it and seeing that it's going to be a big part of the portfolio, understanding that we need to perhaps think about combining resources in order to be able to move forward with a really charismatic project that might have the opportunity to contribute to even the Department of Energy's Earthshot goal of reducing the price of carbon removal. It can be done through sort of biological ways. Trees remove carbon, certainly. It could be done through geologic and engineered ways, technology. We're probably going to have to explore all of these options and really try to develop a portfolio of carbon removal itself. As I mentioned last week, we're excited about our coalition sort of efforts, but some of the other things on carbon removal are probably a year or two away from being shovel ready. So we're not prepared to bring forward something associated with carbon removal during this bond cycle.
Right,
and if I may,
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. And if I may add, we can provide the link to Ramon's presentation. It is very fascinating, and it explains carbon dioxide removal in a very accessible way. So we'll send that out to the group. And if you want to spend some more time on climate action discussions, feel free to at your leisure.
All right, well, thank you. And yes, please, if you could maybe email that out to the committee members on that would be great. So thank you for that offer to do that. Before I kind of sign off and have Vice Chair Al White make any closing comments, I'd like to have Mr. Clifton come back on. We are meeting again next week for an hour and a half. Can you maybe give us a little heads up, what that meeting potential could be to kind of steer us in a direction that will be helpful?
Thank you, Chair. And I would invite Shane and Anderson to jump in on this. We have been working with the consultants and some staff members to start the survey formulation process. We have a very rough draft. It needs a lot of work, not quite ready for prime time, but I know the draft survey is in the hopper, and I know that is also a topic I believe we wanted to broach with this committee next week. Shannon, you want to add a little context to what I just said?
I'd be happy to, Greg. The other items that we plan to bring forward is just checking in on where are we in our timeline, what's to expect next, so that we are prepared to take recommendations to City Council as part of their June 7th meeting. So we'll be bringing that timeline, as well as beginning discussions on methodology to help work with this committee in order to help you build that recommendation for City Council. So those are the 3 topics that we have planned for the March 10th meeting.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Anderson and Mr. Clifton. I know, you know, we're getting to the end, and then where do we go from here? Because I'd like this committee to be very pertinent and also have a substantial and substantive recommendation to the council whenever that time comes to. I do have a hand raised from Ms. McLaughlin, one of the committee members.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I think I looked ahead and I didn't have this meeting on my calendar in April. Like the last meetings were through March. And so I'm guessing we're meeting in April. Is there any way to kind of get some of those calendar invites out through April or whatever you guys think the horizon might be, to just make sure other things don't get booked, quite frankly?
Thank you for the question. I was not aware that we were not on the calendar in April. I do now recall, I think we looked out to March, and that was probably a big bite when we did it, but we need to get on with the April and May calendars. I represented to this committee at the outset that there would be a busy chunk at the beginning, which there has been in these presentations. There will be a time where I think, you know, like during the survey and some other things where there hopefully will be a little bit of reprieve for the committee that might lessen the hectic schedule a bit. But that said, we need to plan on meeting and continue meeting, allow us to confer with our consultants and maybe as we talk about the timeline next week, Donna and others, we could, or Devonna, pardon me, we can add to that discussion the likely schedule in April and May. Shannon, does that sound like a reasonable approach?
Absolutely, Greg, because I think we'll have a better idea of the timeline and what the committee needs to work on in order to get to that recommendation.
Yeah, thanks. Devonna, thank you so much for bringing that forward.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, so thank you. And then with that, we're at 5:32. And so with that, I always like to close out with the Vice Chair, Al White, if he'd like to make any comments or anything add to the discussion.
Thank you, Charlie. I really don't have a whole lot to add to this. I was prepared to suggest a few ideas for how we could start to consolidate thoughts. Incidentally, just FYI, I do have April 7th marked down, but I agree with Devonna. We need to book since nothing else is happening in March except for next week. So one of the things that I guess I would suggest is that there are 16 of us on the committee, and that all of the bond items be numbered in some fashion, and that the 16 of us can go through, and anything that we are absolutely not interested in putting forth, we can mark off. And that way, if you get a list back and there are 16 people that are interested in taking an item off, the list we have to deal with becomes a little bit shorter. And I think that might be a way to edit it. Conversely, at the end of that, we could do the opposite and go through and put down those things that we favor the most in a 1, 2, 3 kind of a ranked choice voting method, and come back with some common ground to start discussions on when we do come back, I guess, in April. So that's a suggestion. If that works with staff and the consultants, I could help you refine it a little bit offline. So thanks for the opportunity again. Chair Odegaard, it's a pleasure. And I'll sign off at this point.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. I just want to thank everybody, Nicole and your team, Jenny and Ramon and many others, putting the presentations together for us. Really appreciate it. And I enjoyed them personally. And actually, I'm probably gonna go find that other one concerning carbon removal. Be looking at that and become a more informed individual. And also thank everybody on the committee for coming together. This is such a huge commitment. And I know the council really appreciates everyone's time. And whatever may happen at the end, the council, I'm sure, is going to be very appreciative with our suggestions of whatever it may be at the end of our service here and serving our community in this way. And so again, so thank you, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Okay, good night.
Night, everybody. Thank you.